Hi there, everybody. This is Jeremy Siskin. I'm the author of Jazz Piano Fundamentals, playing solo jazz piano, and Jazz Piano Fundamentals again. Who knew? And I solicited some questions from my audience, listeners, watchers, whatever you want to call it. I had an Ask Me Anything session. And so today I want to do my best to answer each of those questions. So let's get it rolling. Before I do, it's a little bit late, but let me say a big happy Thanksgiving to everybody. I hope you're having a wonderful holiday weekend, if that's when you're seeing this. All right, so I have a special little camera angle for this, and we're going to start with a question from Dylan, assuming my tech cooperates here. So at Dylan Aji 101 asks, when did you start playing? And the answer was, I was very young. My parents signed me and my brother up for piano lessons when I was probably about 4 years old. Didn't have a lot of music in my family, but we happened to own a piano because my aunt needed to store it, and my parents decided, let's sign the two boys up for lessons. I have an older brother, 2 years older than me, and he hated it, and that means that I loved it, and it's probably the main reason that I'm a pianist today. So thank you, Scott. You know how it goes with brothers. The more that I loved it, the more he hated it. The more he hated it, the more I loved it, and that cycle just kept going. And hey, I'm a professional pianist. Who knew? So yeah, I was pretty young, Dylan, and then I had a really smart teacher for all of my childhood, but she realized when I was about 11 or 12 that I wasn't going to be a classical virtuoso at any point, but I had a really good ear, and I really loved playing. And she had the good sense to send me to a jazz piano teacher because she thought it would be a really good fit for what I liked. So I started taking jazz lessons maybe when I was about 11 or 12 years old. All right, this is an unpronounceable name at TCKGKLJGFL79518. I feel like any question I have for you, you probably have a video on. Yeah, it feels that way sometimes. I love your channel and I learn a lot from it every day. Thank you. Personally, I'd like to know how to dig deep into rhythm and find maybe making your own, say, funk rhythms or just eighth note feel with that stankface kind of lines. Cool. I'm not sure that I'm like the number one person to go to on that. You should watch some Corey Henry videos or something for that. But I'll try to come up with a couple of tips. So first of all, I would say that the way you move your body, the way that you feel in your body is really super important. I had a friend who used to say that for slow tempos, he'd be kind of on his big butt muscles, like sitting on his drums or on his piano bench. So first of all, like get your body involved, really feel it. In terms of coming up with rhythms, I would say make sure you're really listening to the bass line. For any kind of a straight eighth note feel, you're going to want to really lock into the bass line groove. And you don't want to play something identical to the bass line because that's going to be really redundant, but you want to match in with some of those moments where maybe there's an anticipation or an important kind of a rhythmic gesture in the bass line. I'd say that, drumming, whether it's just on your body to like find some grooves, or if you can actually learn to play a little bit of drums, that is really, really helpful. And I totally recommend that. But to me, the key is to really listen to those other instruments and see, like, where could I fit in? Where could I match up sometimes and then go off on my own other times? Ultimately, also, articulation is 100% the whole ball game. Like, if you play a great rhythm with mediocre or non-committal articulation, it's not going to have that groove. But if you play really sharp articulation with each note having, an intent, whether it be short, long, or it could even be in between, like that long but not connected articulation, that's going to be really important. So thank you for asking. Thanks for the nice words. WTF077, can only assume this is Mark Marion, asks, where did you study jazz? And what is your advice for creating beautiful lines while playing? What is the best scales that you like to improvise? So I formally studied jazz at the Eastman School of Music. I do have a degree in jazz performance. Before I went to Eastman, I studied with probably one of the greatest pianists here in LA, Tamir Hendelman. And after I went to Eastman, I studied with one of the greatest pianists in New York, Fred Hirsch. But yeah, my degree is from the Eastman School of Music. My advice for creating beautiful lines, in a word, is sing. So the reason that singing is so important is because you need to be hearing something in your inner ear before you sing. As much as I love analysis, I love theory, it is really not a way to create beautiful melodies, to think about them. You can't create beauty by thinking. You can learn, and you can kind of learn some new things to include or try out by thinking, but it's only going to be by hearing, by singing, by letting that out that you can create beauty. What are the best scales? I am a sucker for the old-fashioned major scale. I think some of the greatest melodies to ever be played have been played with the old-fashioned major scale. It's pretty hard to beat. I've been thinking a lot about pentatonic scales lately. I don't know if you've gotten that from my voicing, but pentatonic scales, are something that I've ignored for most of my career. I was never really taught much about them, but boy, are they interesting. Boy, can you make a lot of cool melodies, and there's so many different ways to combine them. So that's a very basic answer to your question, but it's an honest one. So thanks for watching and for the question, WTF077. All right, Tim Wood, 1987. I know Tim says, I still can't improvise like Keith Jarrett Jeremy. Any tips? I think he originally included some really large emojis with this. And I would say, I've been thinking about this a lot lately, not this specifically, but I think whenever we compare ourselves with somebody, that's going to be a loss, right? I mean, you start thinking about what Keith Jarrett has done. He's recorded the entire Well-Tempered Clavier. He's recorded the entire Shostakovich Preludes and Fugues. So even those of us who have dedicated our lives to this, have studied and studied and studied, I mean, we're so far off. He's also an excellent saxophonist and drummer, besides being a pianist. So, Tim, I would get inspired by Keith Jarrett, but I would try to play better than Tim played yesterday. I don't know how anybody thinks about Joe Biden, but one of the things that he says about elections is, don't compare me with the Almighty, compare me with my opponent. And I think that's actually, there's some good advice there. Don't compare yourself with Keith Jarrett, compare yourself with yourself, and you make your own progress. But I've got some other videos about some Keith Jarrett-esque things that you can try. I've got a bunch of those up, so hope you try it. Tim, I'm excited to be part of your jazz journey, and I know you've been improving a lot. So you're not Keith yet, but I think nobody is. Jacob doesn't ask a question, but I just wanted to express appreciation. It's my pleasure, Jacob. Thanks for watching. I appreciate it. All right, Jim SK7865 says, what are the steps to go from beginner to advanced player, in your opinion? Wow, that's a broad question. Jim, I've written 2 books. Well, really, I've written 3 books that give really specific step-by-step instructions. That's my best answer to that question. I would say that one of the things I realize more and more as I teach and learn about jazz piano is, even though people like me try to put things into an order, there is no straight line of getting there. So I think that if you are really trying to go step by step, you can make some progress, but you also need to find your inspiration and do something that's a little bit too hard for you, maybe not way too hard for you. Get inspired by something and go down a rabbit hole, learn a new tune, find those things that give you joy. Because for me, learning something as complex as jazz is more like forming a web rather than going in a straight direction. And so the more times that you're just involved in enjoying and exploring and really thinking for yourself about how this music works, you're going to find all of these connections in the web. So good luck, Jim. I'm happy to try to get into more detail if you want to reach out. All right, Josh Walsh asks a cheeky question. Did jazz make you this cool, or were you cool before? I don't think there's a single thing that's cool about me. Probably being involved with jazz would be the only thing that makes me any percent cool. But I know that question was not meant seriously. Josh, happy Thanksgiving, buddy. If you haven't checked out Josh's YouTube channel, he's been doing some really fun stuff over there. All right, we've got Billy Midzi 2867. How did you expand your jazz theory vocabulary? That's interesting. So I think there's kind of 2 ways that you want to do it. One is by reading books. When you talk about theory and vocabulary, that means that you're finding names for things. And you can find those from studying with people. Of course, you could watch YouTube videos or subscribe to Open Studio and learn the names that people have come up with. But to me, the other side of it is transcribing solos, doing your own analysis, finding patterns so that you actually see how it works in the music. And maybe you'll find something that you can't find a name for. It's actually interesting. I've been doing research for this new book, and there's so many things that you just can't even find on the internet, like how they work, which is really crazy to me. So, that's all to say, don't necessarily rely on dummies like me to tell you exactly what's what. Go out and transcribe your favorite Bill Evans solo and notice the patterns of what he's doing. I'd say there's both like formal study and less formal study. All right, One Divided Soul asks, what jazz standards are your favorite and which did you learn the most from? Love the content. Right back at you. Thanks, One Divided Soul. I don't think too much about having favorite jazz standards. I think like when I consider that, there's the standards that I know really well, and those can be my favorite to play because I don't have to think at all. And those would be, things like blues forms, Your Autumn Leaves of the World. That was the first tune I ever learned. Bye Bye Blackbird was the second tune I ever learned. Things like Sunny Side of the Street, All of Me, those kind of like A-list of standards. I mean, Body and Soul is such an incredibly beautiful tune. I love a memorable melody and a good ballad. It also kind of depends like whether there's a singer with me or not, because lyrics can also be really a dividing factor. I recently posted a video of me playing Skylark with Tony Guerrero, and I love the tune Skylark. I think the lyrics are really kind of cool. I love Wayne Shorter's tune Infant Eyes. So I guess those are, then there's like classic tunes that just mean so much to people, like Smile by Charlie Chaplin is just like, who doesn't love that tune? Or Crazy by Willie Nelson, made famous by Patsy Cline. Like, I just love that song. It just hits me in the chest every time. So that's partial list for you. Alexis Thomas Schlachta, asks, could you please give us your approach of playing in a trio, two-handed, rootless voicings, or rooted? That question's getting maybe a little bit technical for this activity, but I mean, there's so many different ways to play in a trio. I guess the first thing that I would say is, yeah, you're right. I mostly don't play the root if there's a bass player with me. I'll usually try to stay away from that. And if there's a trio, I need to be playing the melody in my right hand. So I guess I'm not too sure. Let me answer it in this way. One great way to play in a trio is to think like a big band. And this is, to me, what Oscar Peterson does mostly when he's playing his best in a trio situation is he's almost making like a big band arrangement. And he'll put in big block chords sometimes. He'll put in more of a chordal passage other times. Sometimes he'll just comp in his left hand and play melodies with the right hand as well. So I think if I had to give you a succinct answer, I would say that I would think like a big band, and avoid those roots in your voicings. And certainly you can see a lot of stuff on the channel or in my books if you're looking for specific voicing types. I have a video called First Lesson in Jazz Piano Voicings that, to me, those would be good voicings to use in a trio. Also, that Jazz Piano Fundamentals Book 1 has some solid trio voicings for you too. So I hope that helps. Vizia Films writes, how do you get in the zone on stage and forget about everything else that's happening in your life? Great question. I mean, certainly part of the answer is that you don't always get in the zone, right? I mean, especially with the world these days, there's not an on-off switch. But a few tips that I would have, one would be try to listen. As much as we're involved in playing, we want to be present listening, both to ourselves and, if we're on stage with other people, we want to be really paying attention to how they're playing. And the more we listen, the more we forget about ourselves. And I think that's really, really healthy when you're on stage. The other thing that I try to do intentionally is to tap into some kind of I tapped into some kind of emotion. And so I might really be thinking about the emotion of a tune, like the lyrics of a tune, for instance. I might have a mental image in mind or a story that I want to think about. But I'll also, I'll do things like bring a book that really makes me feel a certain way, or a poem, or listen to another recording. And a very practical thing, when I play solo concerts, I starting with a free improvisation, because that kind of forces me to get out of any kind of feeling of I have to do this way. I have to play this tune in this arrangement at this tempo. But instead, it puts me in an exploratory mindset, and I really enjoy being in that mindset. So thanks for writing Vizia Films. Brian writes, Brian 106699, and I'm sorry, I'm going to do a bad job from a tech perspective. He's writing, what are your thoughts on how the Giants became so prolific? How did Oscar Peterson, or you pick the artist, develop such a vast vocabulary, technical skill set, and repertoire of tunes always played from memory at such a young age? Yeah, he was really good. But I think there is something, so like I said, I find that this learning is like a web. And so if you can start making like really a lot of connections, it facilitates other connections. For example, learning tunes. I don't know the most tunes in the world, but I know more than most. And what you start doing as you really master progressions is you start seeing so many similarities between different tunes, right? And so if you're going to learn a new tune, when you're really experienced, when you get that skill going, it takes, an hour, whereas, I'm sure many of us, including me, have had this experience of learning a new tune, and it takes you days, weeks, months to memorize the tune. So part of it is just that I think especially those greats who started at a really young age, they're gaining that skill set. And this is one of the hard things about teaching and learning jazz is, of course, you want to learn the piece, but each thing is also teaching you a concept or a skill set. As you're learning the piece, you're learning how these chords fit together. As you're learning a voicing for one tune, you're learning a set of voicings that can be applied to a lot of different tunes. But also, some of these people were just absolute geniuses, and their minds work in ways that I can't really understand. But yeah, for me, that's part of the skill of learning jazz, is being able to manage, on one hand, the specific, and on the other hand, the general. Let's keep going. Brian asked one more question. How do you add virtuosity into your playing? That's an interesting question and an interesting way to state it. How do you add virtuosity into your playing? You play fast. So my knee-jerk reaction, and this isn't very fun, is that if you're trying to add virtuosity in, it's not going to end up coming out right. You have to be imagining first things that you want to accomplish that happen to be virtuosic, right? If you're saying, well, I'm going to add a lot of fast stuff in, it's probably going to sound like you're adding something that the music doesn't want. But if you start hearing these faster lines, that's going to be really important. So I would say, first of all, listen to music that inspires that kind of thinking in you. If it's Oscar Peterson, if it's Art Tatum, listen to them and figure out where are the kind of like cadences of how do they use this, right? And you'll hear in the greats that, it's not virtuosic all the time. They're using it to create energy and to create surprise and to create variety. So I guess I would point you in a slightly different starting place. That said, I would also suggest borrowing a lot from classical music. So much classical music is written to be virtuosic. So if you can master some of these classical pieces and some of these gestures and devices that Chopin and Liszt and other great classical composers are including, then you might find a way into adding virtuosity to some of your jazz pieces. Blake Whatcott, 909, asks, have you experimented with Baroque improvisation? Yeah, I've never really tried to be a Baroque improviser. I always, for people interested, I always point people to John Mortenson's work because he's been so incredibly studious about that. But when I was a senior in college, I got to take 2 classes that really changed my life. They were both independent studies. One was an independent study on improvising in the style of Debussy preludes. The other was an independent study on improvising 4-voice fugues in the style of Bach. Don't ask me to improvise a 4-voice fugue. I could do a really BS version right now. But it did teach me about thinking in different voices and thinking about making music from a contrapuntal vantage point rather than from a kind of top-down chordal vantage point. So I've experimented. I wouldn't give a concert of Baroque improvisation anytime soon because, no one will want to hear it. Thanks for asking, Blake. Piano Weekends 68 asks, can you please tell us your very first experience as a new young pianist with a jazz band and the difficulties you faced and what you did with some examples to overcome those challenges afterwards? Okay, yeah. For me, as I started, for instance, in my high school jazz band, the biggest challenge for me was that I was a bad sight reader. And so every time, it's one of these things that when people have a good ear, their reading is usually bad. And when their reading is good, usually they don't rely on their ear at all. So I was totally relying on my ear. And so the first few times we would play a piece, I would just fall all over myself. So that was probably the biggest challenge. And I did get over it. I do consider myself a pretty good reader at this point. And the way that I did it was I used this book called Modern Reading Text in 4/4 by Louis Belson. And I just spent a whole summer, and it's just rhythms laid out. And rhythms was always my difficulty with sight reading. And I just worked through it during the summer and figured out in a non-BS way, how do all these rhythms actually sound when they're written on the page like this and this and this? And I came back and I was a much stronger sight reader. But yeah, that was really probably the biggest obstacle that I can remember. Stefan Hofer asks, hey, I'd be interested in your take on improvising with more than one note, e.g. towards the end of a solo to increase intensity. I struggle to develop this. Octaves plus left-hand voicings, drop voicings, fourth. So I think you maybe have the devices probably. The way I would practice it is I would first practice harmonizing melodies. Take, nursery rhymes. Take Mary Had a Little Lamb and whichever, drop two voicing. And then once you get good at 3 or 4 nursery rhymes, take a simple jazz tune, take Bye Bye Blackbird and play it with drop 2 voicings. And once you do that with 3 or 4 jazz tunes, take a more complicated jazz tune or even a transcribed solo and slowly try to practice. What is this? Anthropology? For me, it's also really helpful to write things out. You don't have to notate every note here. You could write yourself little tips about, remember there's an A natural in here. Or, this is kind of a C diminished chord here. But that's what I would do. I would work on really simple melodies, somewhat simple jazz melodies, and then more complex melodies. I do have quite a lot about closed position and drop 2 in the Jazz Piano Fundamentals Book 2 book, if that's interesting to you. And there's also stuff about shout chorus voicings, which is like left-hand 4-note voicings plus octaves. So I hope that helps a little bit. That's how I would go about learning that scale. Daniel Neuheiser asks, can you do a deep dive sometime on the 1-flat-3 diminish and how it relates to the subdominant movement? It seems like a lot of Christmas tunes have this movement. If you could talk about this. I'm going to table this question for now, Daniel, because I need to think about it, and maybe it is worthy of a deep dive. But what I think Daniel's talking about is like, there's frequently this diminished chord connecting between the 2 and the 3 chord, or the 2 and the 1 chord in first inversion, or it can go the other way. I'll just give you a hint of one way that I think about it is that what all these chords have in common is they have a C. And so to me, it may or may not even be about that it is a diminished chord, but it's like these tenths moving all with a C. Right, that note never changes. And that creates a little through line in the harmony. If that helps, run with it, but I'll think about doing something more on that. Thanks, Daniel. John Evangelista 1247 asks, my question is not about theory, but where does one begin to learn mastery and control of the keyboard? That's a good question and a big question. For me, I think classical music is really important. I have a hard time teaching or explaining or learning jazz piano and technique simultaneously. Now, there certainly are some ways that you could work on technique within a jazz context, but for me, playing classical music and studying with a good teacher really is the most direct way to get really great technique. If you can't find a good teacher or you can't afford it or whatever, Tone Bass has just incredible lessons with a really wide variety of teachers. So that might be a really good resource for you, Tone Bass. I've got some jazz stuff up there as well. For me, just about every one of my favorite pianists I can think of studied some degree of classical music. And certainly among modern pianists, man, there's a lot of modern pianists who are really good classical pianists. You think about a Chick Corea, you think about a Brad Meldau, a Keith Jarrett. These guys are monster classical players as well as jazz players. Doesn't mean that you have to perform it, but it means that you're going to learn a lot from it. Jeremy Kokiyar 322, first of all, nice name, says, how do you keep a clean music sound and touch while improvising specifically a fast tempo? That's an interesting question. I don't consider myself an expert on that. So first of all, you got to do a lot of fast practice. A lot of players play more staccato as they get to a faster tempo. I'm thinking of like a Chick Corea or McCoy Tyner. Really use a really shallow and firm fingered touch, but really they're playing staccato and it sounds legato because it's going by so fast that of course the notes kind of bleed into one another. So that would be part of it. I think another part is that you have to use your large muscles to do large muscle things and your small muscles to do small muscle things. The worst thing you can do is to tense up. It's going to be really hard to play fast if you're tense. I've got a couple of videos where I address some of this stuff. So if you're interested about what I mean by the large muscles, check out the videos on Abby Whiteside. And then I have a video called something playing smoothly at fast tempo, playing easily at fast tempo, where I talk about Donna Lee and an exercise of clustering Donna Lee. So those two things might be of interest for you, but it's a tough question. I don't have a clear answer. Also, psychologically, make sure you're not thinking fast. If you think fast, you're going to be in trouble. If I'm playing 1, 2, 1, 2, and thinking 1, 2, 3, 4, 2, 2, 3, 4, I'm immediately getting tense. I don't think I'm going to be able to play phrases but if the tempo's 1, 2, 1, 2, I'm thinking. Right. I'd also just practice scale patterns at really fast tempos. There is going to be something sacrificed when you're at fast tempos. You're not going to be as free improvising when you're at fast tempos as when you're at slower tempos. So you are going to have to rely sometimes on stuff that you've memorized and practiced, like scale patterns, okay? So I hope that helps a little bit, Jeremy. Thanks for watching this channel. Bake Sun Chong says, when's the modal jazz piano book coming out? And it is true. I don't know if I've mentioned it on this channel, but I am working on a 3rd level of jazz piano fundamentals. That's going to be about modal and modern jazz. And I'm aiming for January 15th. No guarantees, but I think that feels pretty doable to get it out by January 15th. So keep your eyes out for that. If you haven't joined my email list, that's going to be the best way to get a notification when it comes out. And there should be a subscription link below. All right. I think I've got 5 more questions. Anyway, 3327 says, what's your favorite book, tune, jazz piano player, and why? Well, of course, my favorite book is Playing Solo Jazz Piano. I read it every night before I go. No, I'm just kidding. My favorite book, I'm a big literature guy. I think Don DeLillo at his best has written some books that really mean a lot to me. I think White Noise is pretty brilliant. I'm also a big Paul Auster fan. I think the New York Trilogy really made a big mark on me. I love Bolaño. I love Haruki Murakami. And I'm sure there's a lot more that I'm not thinking of. I guess I already answered about my favorite tune. My favorite jazz piano player, Fred Hirsch has been a huge mentor to me, and I've drawn so much from his music that, gun to my head, if I had to choose, I'd choose Fred for both musical and personal reasons. And yeah, I'll add to that why a little bit in terms of the musical reasons. So for me, he's just added so much to what the piano can do in a jazz context. That's made it much more fun for somebody like me to play and to play around with the piano. But he still really honors the jazz tradition, and he can play as good as anybody. So I'm gonna go with Fred. All right, Percy O'Dayan 4991 asks, thanks for your generosity and sharing your knowledge. How would you practice dynamics on ballads? How would you practice odd time signature songs for solo piano? Cool. So dynamics on ballads, I guess first thing is, I assume you mean that you probably want to play softer rather than louder. One great Kenny Barrett exercise that he would do with his students is that he would hold the soft pedal down, have the student hold the soft pedal down and have them play the ballad, really listening to the sound that they get with the soft pedal on, and then have them match that sound without the soft pedal on. So you have to be listening and then matching that sound and then really control it. Of course, anybody who knows anything about the piano knows that the soft pedal actually makes you play just one string. So the tone in the timbre is going to be different, but I think it's still a useful exercise to try to strive to make that sound just as crystalline as when you use the soft pedal. Another way to practice on ballads would be to practice really separating the melody and the rest of the chord, because you really want that melody to sing out well above the rest of the chord. So play just the melody for 4 bars, then play just the non-melody parts and make sure that you're balancing appropriately for each, and then try to bring them together separately. That's another idea. In terms of odd time signature songs, I have done I've done a couple of videos on this. To me, it's all about finding the clave on an odd time signature. So, if you're in 5, it's going to be like 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 1, 2, 3. And like getting that really, really deep locked into your head so that you can come back to it, go away from it, and, practice with play 2, 3, 1. Right, the left hand's practice it, playing the clave. Right, and so as I'm soloing, so check out my video if you want more information on this claves and a little bit more about the process. But to me, that is the way into improvising in odd time signatures. Okay, Caston asks, do you play any instruments besides the piano? The answer is not well, not in any way that I would do it in public. When I was in school, I had to take a music class and there wasn't room for a piano, so I learned how to play the upright bass in a classical context. So I still kind of know where the fingerings are, but I'm not good. And you can't really just grab an upright bass and play it in a jazz context because your blisters are going to be awful. My COVID project was learning how to play the drum set, and I took lessons with my dear friend Dave Tedeschi, and I got decent. But again, I wouldn't want to do it in public in front of anybody, and I've gotten too busy since the pandemic kind of ended to keep that up. I'd love to get back to it at some point. I play a little bit of guitar. I've always dreamed of playing the guitar, but it's just frustrating. The piano is so logical and the guitar is so illogical that I haven't really, although I really enjoy the sound and the music, I haven't enjoyed the process of learning it. I was hoping I'd be faster. So the answer is I've dabbled, but not really. Jacob Coolman 1616, hey Jacob, asks, what does the future of improvised music sound like? And I would answer that it sounds like a lot of things combined. I think the big trend of our last 10 years probably was bringing in world music aspects into jazz and improvised music. And I think there's been so many cool results, so many interesting combinations. I think it's definitely already started, but the trend of right now in the next 10 years is bringing in different kinds of electronics that we can use spontaneously to create improvisation. Certainly that's been a part of jazz history, using synthesizers has always been present, but I think there's just so many interesting things that are happening now that I think that's going to be a huge part of the future. I think, ironically, the technology that's happening now also creates interesting interaction with the past. Now we could have Miles Davis, an AI Miles Davis, playing along with a modern pianist. If you've ever wanted to hear a duet between Brad Mehldau and Miles Davis, hey, we could probably do some version of that soon. So to me, that's another direction that the music is headed, is that maybe at home you can play with your favorite current musicians or your favorite jazz legends or pop legends or whatever it is. So I think we have a lot of interesting things coming our way from a technological standpoint. And I think this is the last one. The Nezpa asks, my question is, when and what got you into your jazz piano playing journey? Did you get some gigs that you called? Did your dad listen to a lot of jazz records? Were you taking classical lessons and then heard something hip on the radio? Cool. Thanks for your question. It was a combination of things for me. So I started playing piano young, as I referenced. And as I referenced, I had a good ear, but bad technique. I also had an uncle who was really into Oscar Peterson, who sent me some CDs when I was 12 or 13. But I've always loved improvising, maybe more so than jazz as a style. I just love the feeling and the process of improvising. And so that was really a big part of it, was that even when I would play classical pieces, I would always try to improvise a new section or add to it. So I think for that reason, jazz kind of seemed like an obvious fit. I guess it continues to be a pretty good fit. And certainly I've found a lot of musicians in the jazz style that I really enjoy and want to replicate and listen to all the time. But for me, the thrill is that just amazing feeling of having a flow process and coming up with something brand new on the spot. So yeah, I had an inspiring teacher, and then I do thank my Uncle Lloyd. If you're watching, thanks, Uncle Lloyd, for sending me some Oscar Peterson records when I was younger. Oh no, I have one more question from Jeremy. Could you make a list of jazz standard or modern songs that you suggest learning and knowing, and a few songs that are not well known but really amazing to listen to? I could make a list, but I think if you do a little internet sleuthing on your own, there's a bunch of lists out there. I think learnjazzstandards.com has pretty good lists of the most essential jazz standards to know. In terms of a few songs that are not well known, but amazing to listen to, discover, and play, maybe instead of suggesting particular pieces, one great resource is that there's a Keith Jarrett Live at the Blue Note box set, where they play mostly standard tunes, and they play some really familiar standard tunes. They certainly play Autumn Leaves and Days of Wine and Roses, but then they also play some less familiar ballads, and some less familiar other tunes too. So maybe besides me telling you, I would assign you to go listen to that Keith Jarrett Live at the Blue Note box set. I think there's 6 CDs, and find 2 or 3 tunes if you're into that you really enjoy. I think also a lot of musicians listen to the Ella Fitzgerald Songbooks box set, which covers so many of the greatest ever songwriters, both from Broadway traditions and jazz traditions, and you can hear the lyrics in those albums as well. So that would be another really great resource to hear some tunes that you might not be as familiar with. All right, everybody, I think that's it. If you watched all the way to the end, thank you for spending the time with me. I hope you heard something interesting today. Why don't you comment with the words frequently asked questions in order to have a little secret code. Have a wonderful holiday weekend, and thanks for including me as part of your world. I'll see you soon.